Hi, I'm Dr. Chuck Betters with Mark Inc. Ministries. I want to encourage you to visit our website, markinc.org, and you will find there a whole host of resources designed to be helpful to those of you who are hurting, those of you who are experiencing some form of sorrow. Today's question is not one of sorrow, although I sense a strain in the person's question. I sense a real heartache here concerning something that they believe they ought to be doing, but that they're not doing. So let me read the question to you. Does God still want us to tithe 10% of our gross income when we are struggling financially? And then she goes on and gives a little background. Despite us both having full-time jobs and cutting back in so many ways, because of unexpected medical bills, funeral bills, etc., we still can never pay off our credit cards. It's a huge weight on our shoulders. No matter how hard I try, I am ashamed that I'm not able to give my tithe out of joy as God desires, because I'm always thinking how half of our yearly tithe amount would eliminate our credit card bill. I wish the Bible said more about the subject. Well, that's a very good question. And there are two understandings of the tithe in Scripture. There's the Old Testament understanding, and then there's the New Testament understanding. When we visit the Old Testament passage in Malachi 3:10, the prophet Malachi accuses Israel of robbing God because they were not giving the full tithe, bringing the full tithe into the storehouse. In chapter 10, he says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. But he couches that with this expression, that you're robbing God by not doing so. Now, when we come to the New Testament, Jesus is standing before the Pharisees, who were meticulous in how they not only produced the tithe, but how they gave the tithe. He looks at them and he says, you're very meticulous. You count your plants, you count the seeds that you have, you count the fruit that's on the vine, and you adequately take that fruit and you divide it up and bring 1/10 of it into the storehouse. And he commends them for that. He says, these things you ought to have done, but their hearts were not right. That's why he says in that passage that the heart is out of place, and their heart is not working in conjunction with the heart and the mind of God. And so they are commended for bringing the tithe, but they are condemned for bringing it with the wrong attitude. When we who live on this side of the cross are to understand the tithe, we can become very legalistic about it. We can become very legalistic about how our giving must match 10%. It must be of the gross and cannot be of the net. And there's very little in the New Testament that speaks to this. The only passage that we have in the entire New Testament that tells us or commends us for the tithe is the one I just quoted you. When Jesus turns to them and says, you ought to have done this. But there's something much bigger than whether or not it's 10% of your income. That's what your heart looks like when you give it. So people can give out of obligation, or people can give out of love. Now imagine this. Imagine you are very, very poor. You have no money. You belong to a church made up of very, very poor people. People that maybe today we would say are in government assistance. People who don't have any money, don't have any jobs, and they're suffering financially, and their churches are suffering financially. Well, such was the case with the church at Macedonia, one of Paul's greatest supporting churches. Well, the Corinthian church, on the other hand, was very rich. They had a lot of money. Their people had jobs. Their people were wealthy. They were your upper middle class and your upper class people. And they were complaining about money that was being given to support the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. And so he had to write 1st and 2nd Corinthians to deal with the fact that these people were kind of calling him a charlatan. But when we come to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, we come across a very, very sacred passage. And I want you to listen to this. Paul is saying to this wealthy church, he's saying to the ones who had the money, he says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. That's the poor churches. He says, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means. Well, there's a principle right there. They gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord. Now listen, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints, and this not as we expected. Here is a church that Paul implies he said to stop giving. You don't have the money to give. Other churches have the money to give. You have very little to give. And out of your heart and your generosity, thank you so much, but stop giving. That's the Macedonians, who then came back to Paul and said, you're not going to rob us of the privilege of giving and experiencing the blessing of God. So they gave not only within their means, they gave above their means. Now, I believe Paul meant this to shame the Corinthians. He meant this to come back to them and say, you have the means, but you're holding on to those material resources because you don't trust me to be able to feed you. That reminds me of the great saint in the Old Testament, Abraham, who God spoke to on many occasions, do this and do that, and Abraham moved and did this and did that. But when he landed in his land that God had promised him, the land was experiencing a great famine. Abraham packs up his bags with no instructions from God to do so. He packs up his bags and he heads to Egypt for one very simple reason. He did not believe that God could feed him in a famine. He did not believe that God was resourceful enough to feed him in the land that was experiencing the famine. So he takes off to Egypt. And while in Egypt, horrific things happened to him. He lies about his wife. He gets in trouble with the king. He picks up Lot, who became a burden around his neck. He experienced all kinds of pain and sorrow because God did not tell him to leave. He did not believe that God could feed him in the famine. So when people are tithing or trying to tithe, you do so within your means. You do so with a heart that is joyful, a heart that wants to give. And honestly and truly, I don't think the church that you're going to can be blessed if you give with resignation, if you give out of obligation rather than out of grace. I encourage people to test God. That's what Malachi says in the Old Testament. God says, test me, prove me, test me. And I believe the best way to do that is, okay, say this week you give 1% of your income. And then the next week you give 2% of your income, or maybe space it out a little bit further, maybe a month later, or 2 months later, 3%, 4%, 5%. But when you reach 10%, and God has proven again and again and again that He has blessed you, then you must give beyond the tithe in what we call sacrificial giving. We give until it hurts. And when it hurts, we give some more. That's the kind of heart that God blesses. That's the kind of attitude that God blesses. So keep in mind Abraham. Keep in mind the two patterns of giving. Keep in mind the Macedonians. And then begin to examine your own circle of giving, your own lifestyle. And as God continues to prove to you that He is up to the test that you are giving, incrementally increase until you are able to give sacrificially. And I know God will bless that.